Here, here.
I call a member for Buderim.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I rise today to speak to the Vegetation Management and Other Legislation Amendment Bill 2018. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Committee Secretariat who worked tirelessly on this bill and my fellow committee members. I'd particularly like to acknowledge my LNP colleagues, the member for Bundaberg, who you just heard from, Mr David Batt, and the member for Condamine, Mr Pat Weir. Mr Deputy Speaker, this legislation is fundamentally flawed and it should not be passed. At its heart, this legislation is based on toxic ideology rather than fact. Those opposite have been motivated by self-interest rather than the best interests of Queensland. And that's clear because we saw this bill introduced to the House in March, and here we are just over a month later, and those opposite are rushing this legislation through, effectively ignoring the submissions of 13,000 Queenslanders who attempted to have their say. As the committee travelled briefly across the state to receive submissions on this bill, we heard of heartbreaking stories about the effect that this bill will have on farmers and on communities. Families told of their despair and of their fear that the property that they'd sustainably farmed for generations may no longer be viable. Communities like Charleville told of their fear that this bill would result in the degradation and destruction of their home. And yet, the Labor members of the committee continue to support this bill despite the fact that they know it's flawed and doesn't take into account the damage that this will do to farmers and to our rural communities. The time has come for the Labor members of this committee, the members for Bancroft, Mount Omni and Ipswich West, to stand up and to do what's right. The farmers of Queensland need someone in the government to listen to their concerns. Unlike the Minister for Agriculture, who's hidden from scrutiny since the introduction of this bill, at least the members for Bancroft, Mount Omni and Ipswich West travelled the state, and they know this bill is flawed because they have seen the impact firsthand. They've heard from young families who have lost hope for a future in agriculture. They've seen grown men break down in front of them as they contemplate a future where their livelihood is destroyed. To simply ignore these concerns shows the contempt that Labor has for rural communities. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, my message to the members for Bancroft, Mount Omni and Ipswich West is simple. Stand up for what you know is right, have some conviction, show some backbone, cross the floor and oppose this bill. Save the rural communities and the farmers who feed and clothe you. And I recognise that the members for Bancroft, Mount Omni and Ipswich West will suffer at the hands of their ignorant union masters if they do cross the floor. But standing up for what's right is never without a cost, and they should do what's right. Perhaps those opposite can't understand why Queenslanders are so concerned about these laws.
Members, thank you. The member has the call.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Why are rural people and their city cousins so concerned with the impact that these laws will have on those who feed and clothe us? And I guess it's understandable that those opposite would be ignorant when you consider that their Agriculture Minister is a figurehead in Brisbane who rarely ventures out of the comfort of his office to speak to the people who are impacted most by his decisions. I've been teaching my children about how their actions impact on other people, how they need to consider the needs of others, not just themselves. My 3-year-old can grasp that, but seemingly those men and women who sit in the privileged position of government cannot, and it's quite simply appalling. Given that those opposite have so little regard for the impact these laws will have on the people of the bush, allow me to enlighten you a little. Farmers and graziers put the food on your table. Later today, when you enjoy the food put in front of you by the excellent catering staff here at Parliament, just remember who put the food there. Farmers. Queensland farmers whose livelihoods are being put at risk by these laws and by decisions made by Labor members. And it's clear that Labor are only interested in green preferences and that they ignore all of the science that should underpin any vegetation management legislation. And that may be the case, but your ignorance of the science is disgraceful. And one would think that the Minister for Agriculture would want to hear the concerns of those he represents in the agricultural sector. But he's been pathetically silent on this issue, which is one of the most significant threats to agriculture in this state and one that clearly has rural communities and agricultural producers concerned. Mr Deputy Speaker, I wonder if Minister Furner has the courage to go back to the Haken family in Cloncurry and explain to them why he intends to vote for this bill. If he had any moral courage, he'd front up and explain his position. But the minister won't, because he clearly doesn't care about the farmers of Queensland and he's only interested in where he can get a photo opportunity. Farmers and graziers are usually born on the land and they make their living and feed their family from the land. They nurture and protect it to pass it on to the next generation. At their heart, they are the true environmentalists. And I quote from Grant Maudsley, the President of AgForce Queensland, in his submission to the committee, when he said, well, you do well to listen to him, the member for Bancroft, because he does represent the farmers of Queensland who are a stakeholder in this piece of legislation. And you failed to do so, and that is why you were condemned.
Member for Buderim.
He said,
Member for Buderim, please speak through the chair, not directly across the chamber, and do not use the word you.
My apologies, Mr Deputy Speaker. Mr Maudsley said, we have to grow food for this state and we have to look after the environment. We accept that and we are proud to do that. I come from a family of graziers. My mother's father and her mother, they managed and owned cattle stations in Queensland and the Northern Territory, as did my grandfather's parents. And I know the value of looking after the land, of caring for our environment and farming sustainably. These are practices that I still apply today on my own small property, where my wife and I are focused on managing our land sustainably while still running a commercial cattle operation. And it's a simplification by those opposite to assume that they know better than farmers when it comes to managing our rural environment. In fact, it's downright patronising. I was very concerned that no modelling has been undertaken in relation to the effect this legislation will have on future agricultural production in Queensland. When questioned on this matter during committee hearings, departmental officials admitted that no modelling had been undertaken, and staggeringly, none was planned. Despite the mountains of submissions this committee received from farmers and landholders raising this very concern, the Labor government still sees fit to ignore them. We heard from a fourth-generation farmer, Scott Dunlop, who outlined his concerns about the economic impacts of this bill when he said, I think that economic modelling is extremely important. I do not think it's being considered at all how this is going to affect individual operations, which in turn is going to affect all communities. This legislation is going to cause a significant downturn in employment and the death of rural communities. But it's easy to dismiss that which you can't see right before your eyes. But frankly, this Palaszczuk Labor government has no excuse. Not only are they paid by the taxpayers of Queensland to open their eyes and to see the impact of their decisions, but through this very brief committee process, we've seen, through the more than 13,000 submissions from Queenslanders, that they are trying their level best to be heard by this government. Mr Deputy Speaker, the Premier this morning all but gloated about attending an official function in the bush to open a museum. You can't just head out west for a photo opportunity, throw on an Akubra and consider yourself to be a friend of the bush. It might look good on a glossy photo, but frankly, Queenslanders see right through hollow gestures. Farmers had the decency to come to our front door today and the Premier simply ignored them. Those opposite could have listened to the stories of Queensland farmers as they've been trying to tell them. They could have come down to this morning's protest, showed some courage, showed some backbone and talked to the people whose livelihoods they will destroy. Those opposite had this opportunity and they have shown they simply don't care. Queensland farmers deserve better. Queenslanders across the state deserve better. They deserve a government and a Premier that stands for the rights of all Queenslanders and doesn't hang them out to dry when it suits her. Queensland need fair laws for farmers and this legislation should be rejected. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
I call the member for Cairns.
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, it's an absolute pleasure